Police horses at the Lancashire Constabulary stables near Preston drink from an old enamel bath. There's nothing unusual in that, except this brass plaque on the wall above the tub. It reads, "This bath was used by Dr. Buck-Ruxton when mutilating the bodies of his wife and maid on an unknown date between the 14th and the 29th of September 1935 at 2 Dalton Square, Lancaster." Hi, I'm Simon Ford. I'm a writer and journalist with, some might say, an unhealthy interest in the grislier aspects of crime and punishment.
I'm Jack Morrell, a former homicide detective. During my 30 years with the British police, I saw my fair share of grisly crime scenes and helped bring a number of killers to book.
And I'm Pip Watts. Like Simon, I was a BBC reporter. He tracked me down and made me an offer I can't refuse.
We are the Psycho Killer team, bringing you tales from the dark side.
Moffatt is a picturesque spa town in the Scottish borders, about 35 miles north of Carlisle. Here, a stream, the Gardenholme Linn, runs down into the River Annan. It's a quiet spot today, and in 1935 it was more peaceful still. In early autumn, tourists would stop and admire the rolling hills of purple heather in full bloom. It was here, on the afternoon of Sunday the 29th of September, that Susan Johnson, a young Edinburgh woman, was on holiday with her brother Alfred. Leaving Alfred in the hotel with the weekend newspapers, Susan strolled down to the little bridge over the Gardenholme Linn. Glancing down into the clear water, she noticed something unusual. It was a fair drop from the bridge to the stream, and she had to peer down into the ravine to be sure. But yes, there was no mistaking it. Poking out of some tattered wrappings where it had snagged on rocks was a human arm. Susan Johnson fled back to the hotel and told Alfred. After a stiff whisky, he went to the bridge and scrambled down the gorge to see what all the fuss was about. It must be a sheep, he told himself, or a shop mannequin. But it was neither. The arm, yes, it was definitely a human arm, was accompanied by a bundle made of, as far as he could tell, newspaper tied up with bed sheets. Inside the parcel, Alfred found pieces of flesh and bone. Swallowing hard to keep down the rapidly rising scotch, Alfred sought out the local bobby, Constable James Fairweather. He telephoned the headquarters of the Dumfriesshire Constabulary and went back to the bridge to wait. So much for a drowsy afternoon in the lounge bar of the Bewley Arms.
Sergeant Robert Sloane was in Dumfries that Sunday afternoon. He drove over and rapidly assessed the scene. There were 4 parcels in the water containing parts of legs, hands, with the tips of the fingers and the thumbs cut off, thigh bones, various pieces of flesh, the chest portion of a human trunk, and 2 heads, both hideously mutilated and unrecognisable. The remains were taken to the tiny mortuary in Moffatt Cemetery, where experts, including John Glaister, Professor of Forensic Medicine at Glasgow University, came to examine them. By the 4th of November, the bits and pieces, as Glaister called them, were being assembled at the anatomy department of Edinburgh University. They were joined by more parcels of flesh and bone, this time discovered at Johnson Bridge on the main road between Edinburgh and Carlisle, about 9 miles from Moffatt. Perversely, the remains included the malformed cyclops eye of an animal, which had been preserved in formaldehyde. Was this a clue? The papers were full of the grim task of assembling 2 human jigsaw puzzles. Anatomists, pathologists, and a dentist attempted to work out which pieces belonged to which corpse. It was clear that distinguishing marks had been removed. The fingertips were sliced off, the eyes had been gouged out, and the teeth smashed. The police followed up on all the missing person reports in the area. A heavy spell of rain had filled the local streams, and as the water level went down, the parcels were left high and, well, maybe not exactly, dry. Detectives found an important clue among the soggy wrapping paper, a special edition of the Sunday Graphic newspaper from the 15th of September 1935 that had only been distributed in the area of Morecambe in Lancashire, more than 100 miles south of Moffatt, on the popular West Coast tourist route. Soon the telephone was ringing at police headquarters in Lancaster, where, by coincidence, officers were investigating the disappearance of a local woman called Mary Jane Rogerson. Mary was 21 and the nanny to the 3 children of an Indian doctor named Buck-Ruxton, who lived and had his surgery at 2 Dalton Square, Lancaster. There were rumours that Dr. Ruxton's wife had left him about the time Mary Rogerson was last seen. The disappearances happened in the middle of September. Jack, what do you make of the evidence so far?
Well, the forensic work in Scotland seems to have been set up properly. I suppose every expert in the country would have fancied getting involved. Despite the excitement over the unusual aspects of this case, the priority for the pathologist, from a police point of view, was identification. Are fingerprints available? Apparently not, owing to the fact that the fingertips were missing. Any distinctive marks, scars, or tattoos on the body parts? This case also shouts out for a good relationship with the press. The sensational aspect of the story should wait. After all, there was a scene to this crime, and it wasn't the bridge over the River Annan. We can assume that inquiries in the area around the disposal sites hadn't revealed anything of significance, such as sighting of a vehicle, for instance. Now, despite the grisly nature of how the bodies were disposed of, the cause of death may have been less exciting. So let's keep an open mind. Could the deaths have been suicide, accident, or even natural causes? Were the bodies removed from a mortuary? That preserved animal eye in the jar? Were the bodies part of a scientific study? It's all something to consider. The newspaper, dated the 15th of September, is interesting because it helps us to establish time parameters to work to. These human remains would appear to have been discarded on or after that date, and not before. The careful reporting of the case is also key, as is the relationship with the respective police areas. What work had been done in relation to the missing person, Mary Rogerson, the nanny to the Ruxton family? From experience, I would think that only the basic inquiries would have been done. The fact that she went missing around the 15th is significant, though, enough to crank that investigation right up. While still a missing person inquiry in Lancaster, I would expect a team of detectives and officers to start asking questions and, more crucially, searching premises. The search of premises in missing person cases is usually done with the consent of the person having control of the property. One such property would be Dr. Ruxton's home and surgery. A man of his professional standing would hardly refuse, would he? A thorough search of those premises for any information relating to Mary Rogerson. The officers would be briefed to keep a lookout for anything odd, evidence of cleaning, excessive tidying, items missing or seemingly out of place.
The Chief Constable of Dumfries sent a detective south of the border to make inquiries. Mary Rogerson's stepmother lived in Morecambe, and she provided 2 more clues. A blouse and a child's romper suit had been used, along with the bedsheets and newspaper, to wrap up the dismembered body parts. Mrs. Rogerson immediately recognised the blouse as belonging to Mary. In fact, it was one she'd bought for her stepdaughter and had recently sewn a patch under one of the sleeves. Mrs. Rogerson also told the detective that the previous summer, Mary had taken 2 of the Ruxtons' 3 children, Elizabeth, Diana and Billy, for a holiday in a guest house at Grange-over-Sands, and the landlady there had given Mary some second-hand baby clothes. The detective paid the landlady, Mrs. Edith Home, a visit, and she identified the romper suit as one of the items she'd donated. And so, with the forensic work continuing in Edinburgh, overall responsibility for the case passed to Captain Henry Van, the Chief Constable of Lancaster.
Dr. Buck-Ruxton was born in Mumbai in 1899 with the name Buck-ruxton-jigsaw-murder, or Buck Hakim for short. He later anglicised his name by deed poll. Dr. Ruxton held 3 medical degrees, 2 from the University of Mumbai and an MB, a Bachelor of Medicine, from the University of London. He'd been studying at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, but failed his exams because he'd become infatuated with a waitress, Isabella-van-es, who was 2 years his junior and estranged from her Dutch husband. Ruxton, who'd served for 3 years in the Indian Army Medical Corps, led her to believe that he was Captain Hakim, although he never attained officer rank, and he encouraged Isabella to join him in London after her divorce. The couple had 3 children between 1929 and 1933, but they never married. In 1930, Dr. Ruxton and Isabella moved with their first child to 2 Dalton Square, a tall stone terraced house next door to a cinema in the centre of Lancaster. Ruxton used the ground floor as his surgery, with the kitchen at the back. The main living accommodation was on the first floor, and there were 4 bedrooms on the top floor. Half of that first floor landing had been turned into a bathroom.
Dr. Ruxton was very popular with his patients. His services extended to dentistry and ophthalmology, the treatment of disorders and diseases of the eye. In public, the good doctor was friendly and affable. But it was a different story behind closed doors. Buck and Isabella rowed furiously, and the rows got worse as the years went by. Ruxton accused the mother of his children of having a dalliance with a young fellow called Bobby Edmondson, a clerk at the town hall on the other side of Dalton Square. Ruxton attributed the rows to what he called Belle's temporary silliness and insisted they both enjoyed the make-up sex. In April 1935, Dr. Ruxton was asked to attend the local police station. Isabella had reported him. Seeing his common-law wife at the police station and realising what she must have done, Ruxton, and these are the words from the detective's notebook, flew into a violent passion and said, "My wife has been unfaithful. I would be justified in murdering her."
I think by now it's becoming clear that Dr. Buck-Ruxton is displaying some of the classic hallmarks of psychopathy: superficial charm, puffed up self-esteem, deceitfulness, and a need for stimulation. And then there's the gaslighting, making Isabella question her own reality, dismissing the arguments as temporary silliness. Scratch the surface, and that nice, obliging young foreign doctor was an abusive tyrant with a volatile temper.
You're right, and I reckon with hindsight that Isabella and Mary Rogerson would have been better advised to take Elizabeth, Diana and Billy and go somewhere Ruxton couldn't find them, or harm them, for harm them he did.
Lancaster was soon buzzing with rumours about Dr. Ruxton and his household. Long before the grisly discoveries at Moffatt, the doctor's patients and neighbours were speculating about the disappearance of Mary Rogerson and Mrs. Ruxton. Maybe he'd got the nanny pregnant. Maybe his wife stormed out in disgust. Maybe Mary was too ashamed to show her face, and so it went on. The charwomen who cleaned at number 2 were particularly good at gleaning morsels of information which they fed into the grapevine. Ruxton himself offered various explanations. Isabella and Mary had gone to Blackpool. They were on holiday in Scotland. Isabella had taken Mary to have an illegal abortion. Isabella had eloped with her lover. The list was endless. Once, a newspaper reported incorrectly that some of the remains found at Moffatt were male. Ruxton read the article in front of his cleaner, Agnes Oxley, and exclaimed, "You see, Mrs. Oxley, it is a man and a woman, not our two," before bursting into hysterical laughter.
Not long afterwards, Ruxton confronted Chief Constable Van, waving a copy of the Daily Express and demanding something be done because the bad publicity was affecting his practice. He demanded the police release a statement that the remains found at Moffatt weren't those of Isabella and Mary Rogerson. That little drama took place on the evening of the 11th of October 1935. Unknown to Ruxton, the police were at that very hour deciding whether they had enough evidence to charge him with the double murder. The forensic team in Edinburgh was making progress, as were Captain Van's detectives south of the border. Here's what they discovered.
On Saturday the 14th of September, Isabella-Ruxton had driven to Blackpool in the doctor's Hillman car. Registration Charlie Papa 8415. Her two sisters from Edinburgh went with her. They enjoyed the world-famous illuminations, and she set off for home just before midnight. She was never seen alive again, but the car was back in Lancaster the next morning, indicating she made it home. How do we know the car was back in Lancaster? Well, at 6:30 a.m, Sunday the 15th of September, Dr. Ruxton drove round in it when he turned up at the cleaner's house to tell her to take the day off, adding, "Mrs. Ruxton and Mary have gone away on holiday to Edinburgh." However, that same afternoon, Ruxton asked one of his patients, Mrs. Mary Hampshire, if she wanted to earn 7 shillings and sixpence scrubbing his staircase. Ruxton said both Isabella and Mary were away, and he'd cut his hand opening a tin of peaches for the children's breakfast. There was blood all down the staircase. He certainly had a nasty gash on that finger.
Mrs. Hampshire accepted. Arriving at 2 Dalton Square, she found the place in a terrible mess. The stair carpet had been taken up, and the stairs were strewn with straw. Upstairs there was more straw poking out from under 2 of the bedroom doors, which were both locked. There were rolled-up carpets and a man's suit in the ground floor waiting room. There were heavily blood-stained carpets, clothes and towels in the backyard, and it looked like someone had tried to burn them. Dr. Ruxton explained that he was getting the decorators in. And that cut on his finger bled like nobody's business. And a good job he'd sent the kids to stay with a friend in Morecambe, which was, in fact, the truth. The mess was so bad that Mrs. Hampshire got her husband to help clean up. And on the days that followed, she helped the doctor's regular chars give the place a deep clean.
Then there was the hit and run. The police had the statement of a cyclist who'd been knocked off his bike by Ruxton's car on the road leading to Moffatt. The doctor failed to stop, but a policeman caught up with him and noticed that the doctor was as jumpy as a flea. This happened on Tuesday the 17th of September.
OK, Jack, do you think at this stage the police had enough evidence to make an arrest?
Yes, I certainly do. Remember that in modern times we have cases where someone is charged with murder, even though the body has not been found. I had the privilege in working on such a case. We convicted a man of murder, where he'd managed to dispose of the body by burying it somewhere. As far as I'm aware, the body has still not been found. We relied on some clever analysis at the scene, blood pattern analysis, indicating that a sustained assault had taken place at low level. The offender had washed most of the blood off, and then redecorated and painted over it. But still, we found those traces. Going back to Dalton Square, and despite the best efforts of Dr. Ruxton to clean the place up, those statements of those key witnesses, that would pass the threshold for sure. Back in 1935, though, it was about 4 weeks after the murders that Ruxton was finally arrested. Unfortunately, it appears that there was a legal ruling that year that was a problem. This ruling stated, in the absence of evidence that a body or part of a body has been found, which is proved to be that of the person alleged to have been killed, There is no onus upon the prisoner to account for the disappearance or non-production of the person. It was basically up to the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John Glaister's bits and pieces were that of Isabella and Mary. Make of that what you will.
Forensic science was in its infancy in the 1930s, but great strides were being made. In England, the country's first National Forensic Science Laboratory opened at the headquarters of Nottingham City Police in 1934. And the work at Edinburgh was groundbreaking. Key to this was Professor of Anatomy James-couper-brash. He was able to get an exact fit between some of the dismembered remains. He used X-rays and anatomical formulae to establish which parts belonged to which body. Eventually, after weeks of painstaking reconstruction, 2 bodies lay side by side in the mortuary. Both bodies were female. Body number 1 was less complete than number 2, but Brash calculated the height in life at 5 feet 5 inches and 5 feet 3 inches respectively. Arthur Hutchinson, an expert in forensic dentistry, helped estimate the age of body number 1 as 20, that was the same as Mary Rogerson. Body number 2 he calculated as being between 35 and 45. Isabella Ruxton was 34.
In the Jigsaw murder case, the way the bodies had been mutilated helped in the search for evidence. Whoever did it had some medical knowledge. It could almost have been the work of a surgeon. For example, a saw hadn't been used, only knives, and very sharp knives at that. The pathologists also found an amount of so-called negative evidence. That is, evidence for a theory provided by the non-occurrence or absence of something. I'm not a fan myself. It's associated more with crime fiction. When I was in the job, we followed the evidence, concentrated on what we knew, not what we didn't know. The team in Edinburgh noted that the eyes, ears, lips and nose from each head had been removed. These are the parts which, after death, show signs of asphyxiation, cyanosis or petechial hemorrhaging. The killer was trying to disguise the cause of death too. They'd been strangled. Was this clever or just very odd? Were the eyes of body number 1 taken out because Mary Rogerson had a slight squint or strabismus in one eye? Had the right forearm been skinned because Mary had a birthmark there? Was the flesh shaved from the right thumb to remove a prominent scar?
Turning to body number 2, the nose had been cut off and the teeth extracted, again by somebody with medical or dental training. Mrs. Ruxton's nose and teeth were prominent features when she was alive. The flesh had been flayed from her legs. Was this because she had distinctively thick calves and ankles? The toes had been clipped off. Was this because Isabella's toes were humped? The list went on. Many of the excisions and mutilations were so precise and corresponded so exactly with the distinguishing features of the missing women that the forensic team was confident in their conclusion. These were the bodies of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerson.
The experts used a technique for the first time. They produced life-size photographs of the head and shoulders of the missing women. They then superimposed them onto life-size photographs of the victims' heads taken in the mortuary. A hush descended on the room when those images were held up to the light. The resemblance was chillingly accurate. On Saturday the 12th of October, Buck Ruxton went voluntarily to police headquarters, where he was questioned for 10 hours before being charged with the murder of Mary Rogerson. The devious doctor put on a look of astonishment and denied the charge absolutely. The police then searched 2 Dalton Square and found more damning evidence, including the kind of sheets, pieces of which had been used to wrap up the bundles of body parts found at Moffatt.
Like you mentioned before, Jack, that search could have been done much sooner, couldn't it, as part of the missing persons investigation?
It could. That said, the scene at Dalton Square had that much evidence. Dr. Ruxton was in the proverbial. On the 5th of November, Ruxton was also charged with the murder of his common-law wife, Isabella.
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world.
Buck-Ruxton's trial, which started on Monday the 2nd of March 1936 at the Manchester Assize Court, lasted for 11 days. Norman Burkitt KC, the so-called courtroom magician, had agreed to defend the prisoner. A Baptist preacher, Burkitt went on to serve as the alternate judge at the Nuremberg war trials. Appearing for the Crown was a formidable team, J.C. Jackson KC, assisted by Hartley Shawcross and David Maxwell Fyfe. Fyfe, incidentally, also served at Nuremberg, where he cross-examined Field Marshal Hermann Goering. Mr. Justice Singleton presided. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Mrs. Ruxton had returned from the Blackpool illuminations. When she went up to bed, a violent quarrel took place. Ruxton strangled his wife, and Mary Rogerson caught them in the act and had to die also. The prosecution called more than 100 witnesses over the next 7 days, and Norman Burkitt cross-examined nearly all of them. The court started filling up with exhibits, bottles, jewellery, piles of clothing, carpets, bed linen. It all led one commentator to remark that it looked more like a jumble sale than a murder trial. Mary Hampshire, who'd scrubbed the doctor's stairs for 7 and 6 that fateful Sunday morning, fainted in the witness box. Lastly, the Crown called the Scottish forensic team, who'd reassembled the jigsaw of human remains. They'd done their work so thoroughly that Burkitt's cross-examination was ineffective, so much so that before the last scientist took the stand, the barrister wrote a note for Ruxton's solicitor to show his client. In conclusion, Burkitt had written, "In my clear and very strong view, if Dr. Ruxton desires to give evidence, we should confine our evidence to him and exercise our right to the last word of the jury. Any other course, in my view, would be absolutely fatal." In other words, we're on very thin ice, chum. If you've got to give evidence, for goodness sake, stick to the script. Ruxton agreed. On the morning of day 8 of his trial, he entered the witness box. His goose was already cooked, so to speak, but the good doctor set about providing his own gravy. Burkitt advised Ruxton to stay calm, listen carefully to each question, and keep his answers short and to the point. But it was soon obvious the arrogant doctor thought he knew best. Burkitt asked Ruxton about his relationship with Isabella. Ruxton replied,
"If I may be permitted to put it in appropriate English, I could honestly say we were the kind of people who could not live with each other and could not live without each other."
Before saying something that wrong-footed Burkitt.
Forgive me the interruption, but I just used the French proverb, "Who loves most chastises most." My mentality thinks in French, and I have to translate into English everything you were asking me.
Undeterred, Burkitt ploughed on, trying to interrupt his client when he started elaborating. It was impossible. Finally, Burkitt snapped, "Perhaps you will just deal with only the questions I put to you." By this stage, the defendant was in tears, which makes me wonder if he was trying to curry favour with the jury by mimicking a genuine human emotion, another trademark of the psychopath. It was an object lesson in how a witness should not respond, and in fact you'll find it used in law schools today, 86 years after Buck-Ruxton stood trial. Norman Burkitt QC. It is suggested here by the Crown that on the morning of the Sunday after your wife came back, you killed her. The defendant, gesticulating wildly.
This is an absolute and deliberate and fantastic story. You might as well just say the sun was rising in the west and setting in the east.
Of course, a simple no would have sufficed. These histrionics confused the jury. Worse, it probably persuaded some of them that Ruxton was trying to hide something. Burkett's next question. It is also suggested by the Crown that upon that morning you killed Mary Rogerson. The defendant yelling,
That is absolute bunkum with a capital B, if I may say it. Why should I kill my poor Mary?
There he goes again, showing hostility to his own counsel and breaking a cardinal rule of the courtroom. Your barrister asks you questions, not the other way around. And what's this about my poor Mary? Was there a romantic attachment between the nanny and the doctor? Were the gossips right? Had they been living in a ménage à trois? Was the last pregnant? All of this would have been left swirling around in the minds of the jurors. The trial lasted another couple of days. Mr. Justice Singleton summed up, and the jury trooped out. Soon afterwards, they returned a verdict of guilty. Asked if he had anything to say about why the death sentence should not be passed, Ruxton held his right hand, palm first, towards the judge and uttered some nonsense or other. It was a little late in the day to try a defence of guilty by means of insanity.
Buck-Ruxton had all the traits of a psychopath. He was manipulative, narcissistic, remorseless, chaotic, and exploitative. It was his temper and his grandiose sense of superiority that were his undoing, and like many psychopaths, he hid in plain sight, hiding behind the mask of a caring, generous local doctor, a family man, with his patient's best interests at heart. Just how wrong can you be? Those who knew him reproached themselves for not noticing something was wrong sooner, but they weren't to blame. They didn't know they were dealing with a textbook psycho.
The doctor's appeal was rejected 6 weeks after sentence was passed, but despite the overwhelming weight of evidence against him, petitions were sent to the Home Secretary calling for a reprieve. The movement to abolish the death penalty was gathering momentum in Britain, as we explained in our podcast about Dorothea Waddingham, the Nottingham nursing home murderer. Both these psychopaths went to the gallows less than a month apart, Waddingham on Tuesday the 16th of April 1936 and Ruxton on Tuesday the 12th of May. Waddingham was executed at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, Buxton at Manchester's Strangeways Jail. His executioner was Albert Pierpoint, the nephew of Thomas Pierpoint, who hanged Dorothea Waddingham. Incidentally, it was Norman Burkitt who acted for the prosecution at the Waddingham trial.
Both murderers were treated equally under the law, and they both paid the ultimate price. The Home Secretary refused to commute Waddingham's death sentence, despite her being a mother of 5, including a 6-month-old baby. Protesters raged that hanging her was inhumane, but I suppose no less inhumane than hanging Ruxton, a father of 3 children, because he was the man who'd murdered the 2 women closest to them, their mother and their nanny.
I shudder to think what the 3 Ruxton children endured. They must have been in the house on that fateful Saturday night and Sunday morning in September 1935, not to mention the abuse they experienced beforehand.
Captain Henry Van, the chief constable, lived to a ripe old age. Originally from Nottingham, he once played football for Notts County. In 1985, BBC Radio interviewed him about the Jigsaw murders, and he revealed that the double murderer wrote to him from his condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison.
Promise me, a dying man, you will be good enough to take an interest in my 3 children. I will bless you and yours from above, if simply you be good to my children. I don't bear the slightest spite against you. Shake hands. Remember me to all.
Elizabeth, Diana and Billy Ruxton went to a children's home where they were regularly visited by their aunts from Edinburgh. Henry Van kept his promise to keep an eye on them and was pleased to tell his BBC interviewer they all made good.
The success of the methods used in the Ruxton case, including photographic superimposition, led to increased public and professional trust in the capabilities of forensic science. Before his execution, the double murderer admitted his guilt.
If you'd like to find out more about the life and crimes of Buck Ruxton, there are plenty of accounts to choose from. We enjoyed the Jigsaw Murders, the true story of the Ruxton killings by Jeremy Craddock, and Jonathan Goodman's essay of the same name in his anthology, Medical Murders, Classic True Crime Stories.
Thanks to Carl Cooper for being the voice of Buck Ruxton. If you're as crazy about true crime as we are, check out our other Psycho Killer podcasts.
We blend a detective's powers of investigation with a journalist's nose for a story. We'll see you again very soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer, shocking true crime story.